Family of God, hello from the MFLO, and peace be with you. Month of February, month of marriage. Titled This Is My Body, we look at marriage in the context of Christ and church in parallel with husband and wife. Why is marriage a vocation and a path to holiness? Do we understand that marriage is a big deal? So much so that it's listed among the 7 sacraments. Why is it that contemporary culture misunderstands the gravity of such a sacrament? How is it that it is so undervalued, underplayed? When we look at marriage in relation to culture, including popular culture, but also traditional or ethnical culture, what are the red flags that we need to look for? But also, what are those components of popular culture, traditional, ethnical culture that can further enrich our Christian and more specifically our Catholic understanding of the sacrament of marriage? Where are we standing with our spousal submission debate or dialogue? Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Husbands and wives, how can we love one another as Jesus has loved us? We invite every husband and wife to ask the question, how can I love my spouse as Christ has loved me? Are we aware of the alarmingly increasing exposure to pornography and how it is destroying our marriages and our families? Just click down in the description box below for the link to our podcast on the effects of pornography on marriage, on families, and on every single one of us. Also, check out our theme card for further reflection and reading. For now, let us listen to missionary of St. Patrick, Father Michael Bennet, who is also an author, sharing some of his wisdom and knowledge with us. Enjoy.
Would you believe it? I left Ireland in 1977. That's a long time ago. And I spent really all my adult life in different African countries, in Kenya for a lot of years, Cameroon, West Africa, Zimbabwe. I've been in South Africa the last 12 years now, is it? Yeah, 12 years. Marriage as a vocational path to holiness. Wow. In 2018, Pope Francis had that document on the vocation to holiness in today's life, and we're all called to be holy. Sometimes we say, oh no, I couldn't be holy, but somebody else can be holy. But holiness comes from God and comes from our relationship to God, and marriage is a call to holiness. Well, I think we have to go back to the basic sacrament, which is baptism, and the priesthood of all the baptized. Okay, I'm an ordained priest. You're not an ordained priest. But still, my primary sacrament is not the sacrament of holy orders or priesthood. It is baptism, just as it is for you. So the link between baptism and marriage, I think, is very real, because in marriage you're living out your calling to be holy within the context of married life and family life and all the requirements that are there. The primary spiritual practice is fidelity to one's commitments in life. What do I mean by that? Primary spiritual practice. Practice rather than just saying prayers. Very important, the saying prayers, of course, but living out your prayerful relationship with God in a practical way. The primary spiritual practice is being faithful to your commitments within marriage, faithful to your wife, to your children, all of that. The theology of the body talks about 4 characteristics of marriage. F, G, F, F. Free, total, faithful, and fruitful. marriage should be free. Those who enter it, they know what they're doing, they enter it freely, they take on the commitments of marriage. T, total commitment to one's spouse and children, etc. F, for fidelity. This is a big challenge, I think, for many men especially. There's a culture of infidelity, I think, here in South Africa. Statistics are telling us that 2 out of 3 black children in South, I'm not sure the figures for white, but for black children, grow up in the absence of their fathers. 40% of mothers, black mothers, are single mothers. Another 20% of the fathers are absent, so you end up with 60, 65, whatever percentage of children growing up in the absence of their fathers. So there's a lack of fidelity there. And then the other aspect is F, for being fruitful. In other words, being open to the gift of life, the gift of a child. If someone enters Christian marriage and saying, well, we won't have children. No, never, never. That's not Christian marriage. There's a need to be open to the gift of love and the gift of life, which is expressed in a wonderful way in the gift of a child. So those aspects of, Christian marriage, family life, that's, I think, the primary vocation. Living out one's vocation in the world today, and that's surely what it's about. And it's a wonderful vocation when it's lived well. I have to live out my vocation to priesthood. My primary spiritual practice is to be faithful to my commitments as a priest, just as yours. You're a married man, to be faithful to your commitments to your wife and your children. And that is your primary spiritual practice. And so it's an ongoing challenge. And that's where we live our vocation. That's where we become holy. That's what Pope Francis is talking about as well. The word sacrament, comes from the word sacred. Halalalong, was that it? Sutu? My sutu isn't too good. It's something sacred, the same root, something holy. The Church talks about 3 categories of sacraments. Marriage is one of the 7 sacraments. Talks about the first category would be the sacraments of initiation, BCE, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist. Talks about the sacraments of healing, penance, confession, and sacrament of the sick. But it talks about the sacraments at the service of communion. There are 2 of them, marriage and priesthood. It's an interesting concept. Marriage as a sacrament at the service of communion. What does that mean? The word service comes in, and communion comes in. Surely it's something to say about service and communion as a couple, communion with God, service of other people as well, other couples too, service of children, communion with children. So there's a lot of concepts I think are intermingled there. The word that comes to me very strongly is the word covenant. Marriage is a covenant. Covenant is a biblical word. It's found very much in all the church documents to talk about the covenant of marriage. And again, what does covenant mean? As I say, it's a biblical word. The Old Covenant, the New Covenant. There are 2 sides to a covenant. There is the Old Covenant, you have God and the people of God, the people of Israel. The New Covenant, God in Christ. And the new community of Israel, which is the church, the people of God, the community called church. And the covenant, it seems to me, contrasts with contract. A contract, okay, you have civil marriage, for example. My understanding of civil marriage is a contract. A couple enter the Department of Home Affairs, section on births, deaths, and marriages, and they enter into a contract before the registrar. They'll be faithful, etc., right? But contracts can be broken. You can get a builder to come along and build you a house, and he's doing shabby work, his work is poor. So you say, I've had enough of this. The contract is broken, and that's it. But in the case of a covenant, Covenant contrasts with a contract. And covenant cannot be broken, because if God is on one side of that covenant, God is faithful. God does not break his covenant. But there's also a covenant between the couple themselves. They promise to be faithful for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, all of that. They consent, in other words, they consent to be committed to each other for better, for worse, etc. And that consent has the aspect of a covenant as well, which is witnessed to by God, by the priest who represents Christ and the community who are present. So this, if you like, this human covenant is integrated into the divine covenant. I think we can say that, yes. The human covenant between the couple, the consent they make to each other, it's integrated into the divine covenant, God's covenant with his people. So just as St. Paul says, just as husband and wife must love each other, just as Christ loved his church. So Christ loves the church, the people of God. Husband and wife reflect that. So they reflect in their own covenant, their consent to each other, they're living out this way of life. God's covenant, God is faithful to his people. He's faithful to this couple, indeed, in the sacrament of marriage. And the sacrament is something that the couple live out. It's not, they confer the sacrament on each other through their consent and through living out a life of commitment, a life of love. Through these characteristics that marriage is free, total, faithful, and fruitful. They're living out their covenant of marriage. And that's why we say that marriage is indissoluble, it cannot be broken. I know that's, it's a challenge, a big challenge, a huge challenge indeed. And, couples entering marriage, I think they do have that sense that it is indissoluble, it cannot be broken because God is involved in this. But again, I would say, unless there are three people for marriage, it's a concept I often use, three people for marriage, not just two, the covenant is not going to work and the marriage itself is not going to succeed. What do I mean? There's husband, wife, and the Spirit of Christ among them. And unless that Spirit of Christ, unless the Holy Spirit becomes real in their lives, if the Holy Spirit is somehow sidelined because of a lack of commitment, then two people on their own, are they going to make it? It's difficult. It's difficult indeed. What I can say that in South Africa, that Christian marriage, it's the sacrament of marriage, living it out, it's very much a countercultural position, because the culture here, I think I said that 2/3 of children grow up in the absence of their fathers. There's only a small group of, probably relatively small group of committed couples. Some are Christian, some are maybe other religions indeed, some are not perhaps involved in any church experience or any religious experience, but it would be small in number, relatively small in number out of all those. The greater majority seem to be single parents who very often are heroic in their efforts to bring up their children. The mothers usually, or the grandmothers, they really do their ultimate best, many of them, and I know them. But the absence of the father figure, it's a far from ideal situation, but they're doing their infinite best. And but I suppose the sacrament of marriage, where husband and wife in a loving family situation, that sacrament is lived out in the domestic church. That's a concept that's used, I think it's in Lumen Gentium, in the Vatican Council uses that. Lumen Gentium talks about the domestic church, the church at home, that reflects the church, the larger church on a Sunday. So in a sense, the small church, which is the Christian family, the church at home, the domestic church. And I think also that if the church at home can have a little altar, which is a place of prayer. Maybe there's a white cloth, a candle, maybe there are holy picture, statue, whatever, Bible. It reminds them of the church on a Sunday morning. We were talking earlier about 3 altars, indeed. You mentioned this to me about the altar that is the place of sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Mass, church on a Sunday morning. The altar that is the table around which the family, the Christian family, prays and eats. They share their food and they share their spiritual food. And the altar that is the marriage bed. Now, I don't know about the marriage bed. That's someone else's experience, but the marriage bed is, presumably, it's about that total commitment where they become one flesh. The two become one flesh, and where they speak the language of truth to each other, through their bodies. Again, sex is not my experience, but my understanding of it is that it's a language of love, and a couple, anyone, can tell the truth with their bodies, or they can tell lies with their bodies. So if it's a language of love, and if the third altar is the bedroom, then it has to be a language of love that is expressed between the couple, and a language of truth, a language of openness. So the physical expression is the physical reality expresses the deeper inner reality, which is the total commitment to each other, and I suppose the consolation through the physical act, and the joy that it brings them, etc., and the affirmation that it brings them. And maybe just one final thought. It strikes me that the distinction between a wedding and marriage. Wedding is for one day only, and marriage is for life. As Christians, we understand that marriage is for life, until death do us part. It strikes me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a strong sense that the more emphasis a young couple put upon the wedding, the less emphasis there is on the marriage, and the less likely the marriage is going to succeed. The less emphasis on the wedding, which is one day only, keep it low-key, invite your family and friends, go through all the preparation, the spiritual preparation especially. The more emphasis on the marriage and on the sacrament of marriage, that the couple understand what the sacrament is about, then, and the less emphasis on the wedding day. I'm not saying you deny the wedding. No, have a good day, have a meaningful day, a prayerful day, joyful day, of course, a joyful day. But see the wedding in the context as one day, in the context of a journey that they're about to begin together, and that a journey, please God, for a lifetime with God's grace. So culture and Christian marriage. The cultural aspect, I think it's not just the culture. Culture is very strong in many African traditions, cultural traditions, and the culture has to be evangelized. It's not to say the culture is wrong or bad. We take what is good in the culture always and evangelize it, bring it to a deeper level, more Christian level, and what is doubtful or dubious in the culture, we let it go. And that doesn't apply just to traditional culture. There's modern culture as well. There's an awful lot of greed and selfishness in modern culture, and, corruption, my sense of me, and my privilege, my possessions, my power, my control, etc. All of that needs to be evangelized. But in the context of marriage, traditional marriage, I suppose, allowed for polygamy. In polygamy, fidelity to one person, as we understand in Christian marriage, would not be possible if you have 2 or 3 wives. So that aspect of traditional culture has to be evangelized. And the message of traditional culture is that, okay, in Christian marriage, there can only be one husband and one wife, and not otherwise, and that growing in love together and commitment to children, all of that. So I think for many couples, and indeed on this occasion that I refer to in Sakani, that for many, even Christian couples, they see traditional marriage as the marriage, the central aspect of marriage. I think for Christians we have to say something different, that Christian marriage, the sacrament of marriage, is the aspect, the most profound aspect of marriage. And it's not to deny the traditional aspect. Oh, no. It's not to deny the payment of dowry, which in the past certainly brought families together, not just the couple, and it cemented the relationship between families. Today I think it's often abused, as far as I can see. Families are looking for money. It becomes a business. I'll squeeze as much money out of this person as possible. So it can be abused. Just as many aspects of modern culture can be abused. So, the tradition and the sacrament there are connections, but there are clearly distinctions as well. There's always a danger that we can take one text on its own in isolation from a broader context. So if there is a text that talks about submission, women submitting to men, there's also St. Paul, in Ephesians, I know he talks about husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for the church. So he's saying, look, husbands, please, you too must love your wives. What does love mean? Love is totally about self-giving, as Christ loved his church, and Christ gave himself for us. And now, ultimately, it's not about feelings, it's about making decisions, it's about determination, it's about will, it's about self-giving love, it's about giving oneself totally and completely to another. Paul is saying that to men in his time. Okay, maybe a negative text, they can be found as well, but reflecting, I would think, the culture of the time. So I think it's unfair just to take a text on its own and say, look, this is this, and this is definitive, this is decisive, and we must... No, there's a much broader context. And the whole message of Christ was about love, surely, and love in every aspect of life, self-giving love. Sometimes I use the concept of love as an umbrella. It's an umbrella concept. What's underneath the umbrella? The umbrella of love, truth, fidelity, commitment, joy, prayer, sacrifice, self-giving, forgiveness, compassion, generosity, kindness. There's no end. Love is an umbrella concept. And that's what, as Paul says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. And Christ loved the church in this umbrella fashion, the concept of love as an umbrella. I think if we talk about submission as well, it's part of one of the topics that are part of the synod sessions, listening sessions here in the Archdiocese. There are 11 themes came from Rome to be discussed in these synod listening circles. 3 were added by the Archbishop Buti. And among the 3 was this issue of patriarchy. Now, patriarchy is about that. It's about patriarchy, patria, man, Latin word. So women submitting to man on top, women beneath them. So I presume Archbishop Buti included this topic among the synod themes because it is an issue here in society. So in Sacraments 2 weeks ago, there was a group on the topic of patriarchy, which is this submission, women submitting to men. I took the notes afterwards, the report of what came, at the end of the session. The group spoke to the smallest listening group circle, spoke to the wider group. They made the report. What struck me about the report was very interesting because they talked about women being subservient to men, specifically in the church context. In other words, women even vote for men to be in positions of authority, parish chairman, etc. Women tend to squabble among themselves. Women do feel subservient to men in that church context because they feel that men should be in control. They should have chairman, secretary, treasurer, etc. should be men, by and large, not entirely, but by and large. That's what came up. And the very interesting thing was that the listening circle did not reflect upon the situation within marriage, their marriages and family life. It didn't seem to be, certainly in that circle, it didn't come up. which I found surprising because I thought it would be the other way around, that they would talk about what's happening in their marriages or families rather than talking about what's happening specifically in the church. So the question we might ask as well, does African culture lend itself to patriarchy? And I'm a man, I'm not an African man. I've lived in 4 different African countries. And if I'm to answer that question myself, my answer will not be popular with men, with African men, because I would say by and large, African culture does tend to put men on a pedestal, and some men can take that too far. I've known men too, especially Christian men, very committed Christian men, who've come off any pedestal and really are one with their wives and children in the context of Christian family, Christian marriage and family life. But even as a priest, I can be on my pedestal, or even people can put me there, just as the culture can put men on a pedestal. Pope Francis rails against this, argues against this totally, putting priests on a pedestal and giving them, positions of authority and honor that is undue to them. He calls this clericalism. Clericalism, he says, is one of the great evils in the church today, where priests are, and a priest himself can have that clerical attitude. I'm better than you, I know more than you, you listen to me, I will tell you what to do, I'm in charge of this parish council. That's clericalism at its worst. And there's a parallel between that clericalism, I think, and the cultural position where men, I'm the boss here in this family, you're my wife, I will tell you what to do. Now, I may be a little bit extreme in what I'm saying, but I think it does take place. This attitude does exist. And I'm repeating myself when I say that I've known African men who have come off a possible cultural pedestal and have lived in a very loving relationship with their wives and children. And I think that's the place to go to. So if we're talking about this issue of patriarchy or, men on top and women below, I think we have to get off our pedestals. If we are men and if we're standing on those pedestals and come down, as much as possible, come down to a place of equality and truth. I'd just like to make one other point, and maybe it's a little bit of a lengthy point, but I do believe that the early years of life are foundational to what happens later in life. And I would say even within the African, certainly the modern African family, or even the postmodern African family setting, marriage, family setting, where I think a lot of people are enlightened. They're enlightened, hopefully, by the best of modern culture, and they let go of the worst of it. And even postmodernity has its faults and weaknesses too. And but when we grow up in a balanced environment, in a loving family environment, the first few years of life are vital, because a child has endless needs for love, for security, sense of survival, security, for affection, for esteem, even for power and control. The terrible twos. A child is 2 years of age and wants, oh, give me this, mommy, give me that, I must have this and that, controlling, powerful. There's a lot of that. Now, if a child either gets too much or is deprived of love, deprived of security, survival, I think of the children in Ukraine at the moment. I think, it must be horrible. Survival, security. Where is survival, security? Where is affection? Mothers are doing their best. They're running away from a war. Their husbands have guns on their shoulders. So how are these war children going to be affected in the future, All right. But what happens is that if there isn't a balanced, loving environment in the family, then children become adolescents and become young adults. And what they lacked in their home, the love they did not know, they begin to seek it in extreme ways very often, unmoderated certainly, ways that where there's a lack of balance. So what do I mean? They're looking for love, for affection, for esteem, for approval in the wrong places. They're looking for too much of it because it was never moderated at home, the balance wasn't there, or because they were denied it, they lacked love and affection at home. So, young people grow up and we see so much of this, and we see it around us here in Far East Rand, where I am. There's so much drink, drugs, alcohol, so many young kids and drugs. Why? You go back to the home environment, basically, the early years of life, the lack of love, lack of affection. But it's just not drink and drugs. There are many young people growing up as well, and they spend far too much time on their cell phones, 3 hours a day on social media. Because they were never moderated, perhaps. Because they're looking for approval on social media. Their stuff is on Instagram or whatever. Approvals, like my photo, how many like it, how many don't like it, So depending on social media, to give them a sense of status and approval, affection. Yeah. Whereas if a balanced approach coming from the family would be, okay, you don't have to depend on social media. You are loved by your mother and father as you are now. You don't need other people to tell you. And they experience that love and that affection and that approval, that security, and it's moderated, it's balanced, all of that. Now coming back to African tradition, if the traditional culture is saying, and as I've said already, I think by and large it is saying, that men can have that status can be on a pedestal. And if children growing up do not receive the love that they need, the balance is not there, and they're coming into a very competitive environment. Social media is making men sending out signals and telling them this is how they must be, how they must look, how they must behave. Then men, again, the patriarchal thing, especially teenage boys, young men, the culture plus the lack of love in the family early on, the lack of balance, it's putting them up there somewhere and makes them less than what they should be, less than whole, less than complete, less than loving. The umbrella concept of love, I think there are many holes in the umbrella and the rain is coming through and there's very little love and affection and compassion, generosity, kindness. And therefore we end up with a culture of corruption. And corruption, we know it's in political society, we know it's in business life. It's a huge issue here in South Africa. But corruption is also in the family. Corruption is in the culture, the modern culture, traditional culture. It's there, and it's, and again, young people watching not just social media, they're watching soapies and all of that. And what are the messages they're getting from there? Is it saying that men must be unfaithful, must be manipulative, must be in control, women must be subservient to them, subjugated to them? So when we talk about tradition and culture, traditional culture rather, and Christian marriage, or the traditional culture and patriarchy rather, I think we're not just talking about traditional culture, but also modern culture. And modern culture includes the soapies and the social media and all the rest. So modern culture plus traditional culture can lead to a greater, more patriarchy, much more than should be there. And that's not good. That's not good. No, we have to come down off that pedestal. And then a final thought. The sacrament of marriage. Very few people, very few probably, in terms of just at a statistical level, there are very few who are in a position to live out the sacrament of marriage. But there are some who do. I don't have a wife and children, but I've come from a Christian family. And for the last 45 years, I've been trying to help couples and families to grow in their love and their fidelity and their truth, etc. So I think I've learned a little bit about it. I've learned a little bit about marriage and family life. And I would say that, It's a challenging vocation. It's a vocation within the church. It's a wonderful vocation. It's a joyful vocation. It's demanding and difficult. And without a relationship with God, I would say it doesn't really work. It doesn't last. It's not alive and well and healthy unless couples are nourished by the Eucharist. A frequent celebration of going to Mass on a Sunday, sharing in the Eucharist, being nourished by the body and blood of Christ, sacrament of confession from time to time, family prayer, all of that. And then meaning and joy comes in. And then the concept of love, the umbrella concept, love as an umbrella, that umbrella is really wide and spacious. And there is joy in a family. In the midst of struggle and difficulty and suffering and lack, there is joy. And Pope Francis talks about this all the time. All his documents, the joy of love, the joy of the gospel. The joy of love is about marriage, He talks about love, and no one can take away this joy from us. The joy of Christ ultimately in our lives. And that's what makes the sacrament of marriage alive and healthy and well. And we must keep on promoting that, promoting Christian marriage and family life. And I think it's a wonderful proclamation to say it is possible. It is possible where there is love, where there is God in our lives.